In the spring of 2020, Atlanta, Georgia, witnessed a new romance that seemed flawless from the outside. Nia Taylor, just 18, was the only child in a wealthy family that had showered her with every luxury imaginable. Her father, a prominent businessman, owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, and her mother spent her days hosting charity events for the city's elite. Nia had been raised in a world of privilege, accustomed to designer clothes, private school, and everything else wealth could provide. She was used to being admired, envied even, and, as some might say, she had developed a taste for the finer things in life. One evening in late May, Nia attended a charity gala with her parents. Among the guests was Leon Brooks, a self-made man in his mid-30s, known in Atlanta's business circles as a rising star in the energy sector. Leon was the CEO of a natural gas extraction company, and though his wealth was relatively new, he had quickly become known for his sharp business acumen. He was tall, well-dressed, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Unlike the other men at the gala, Leon didn't pay much attention to the social scene. He was there to network and expand his business contacts. But when he met Nia, something shifted. He noticed her, and she noticed him. Their connection was immediate, undeniable. Nia, never one to shy away from getting what she wanted, approached Leon with an air of boldness. Their first conversation was brief, polite, but charged, each of them sizing up the other with curiosity. Leon was used to women approaching him, but something about Nia intrigued him. She had a youthful charm, a confidence that seemed almost too mature for her age, and an innocence that drew him in. They exchanged numbers that night, and over the following weeks, what began as casual texts quickly escalated into hours-long conversations. Despite the age gap, they found themselves laughing over the same things, sharing personal stories, and even discussing plans for the future. By June, their relationship had become serious. Leon, though typically cautious, was taken by her energy and beauty. He began inviting Nia to private dinners, exclusive events, and weekend trips. He introduced her to a world that, even with her wealthy upbringing, was new to her, one of high-stakes business deals, negotiations with powerful executives, and the unspoken codes of influence in the energy industry. She was dazzled by his world, enchanted by the mystery of his business and the power he seemed to wield so effortlessly. Nia had never met a man like Leon, and it wasn't long before she felt as though her life before him had been colorless. In early July, Leon invited Nia to move in with him. He owned a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of Atlanta, a modern architectural marvel with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a private lake, imported Italian marble floors, and a garage filled with high-end cars. Nia, excited by the prospect, quickly accepted. She moved out of her family's estate and into Leon's home, eager to start this new chapter with him. For the first few months, life with Leon was everything she had dreamed of. He treated her like a queen, showering her with gifts, dinners, and luxurious trips. They spent their days exploring Atlanta's high-end boutiques and restaurants, and their nights in intimate, candlelit dinners at home. Leon even introduced her to his closest business partners, including executives in the gas and energy sector, which only heightened her admiration for him. She felt as though she was living in a world reserved for the elite, a world that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Yet, even in those early days, subtle hints suggested that there was more to Leon than met the eye. He was private about certain aspects of his business, often taking calls late into the night in a separate room or disappearing for days at a time on business trips with minimal explanation. Nia was too entranced by the glamour of her new life to question him, convinced that his secrecy was simply part of his powerful persona. In these initial months, Nia felt as if she had everything she'd ever wanted, a stunning home, an attentive partner, and a lifestyle others could only dream of. By autumn, just a few months after moving in with Leon, Nia started noticing subtle yet unsettling changes in his behavior. Initially, Leon had been warm, attentive, and seemingly delighted to share his life with her. But as the months passed, his demeanor shifted. He was no longer the charming, engaged partner she had first known. Nia felt the change acutely, as though a cold front had moved into their home. It started with Leon's silence. He became unusually quiet, his once lively conversation reduced to simple, functional exchanges. His smiles became rare, his laughter almost non-existent. More and more often, he would spend hours locked in his study, only emerging late at night, when Nia had already gone to bed. If she questioned him, he would offer curt replies, his face a mask of tension and fatigue. He often attributed it to business pressures, which Nia, at first, accepted without question. She knew his line of work was demanding, and his success required long hours and concentration. But it wasn't long before she felt something more was lurking beneath the surface. Leon's absences grew more frequent and less predictable. On certain mornings, she would wake up to find he had already left the house, not returning until late into the night. When she asked about his day, he brushed her off with vague answers, barely explaining his whereabouts. He stopped inviting her to business events and social gatherings, claiming they were strictly professional or not worth her time. Gone were the days of shared dinners and intimate conversations. The life they had built together was eroding, piece by piece. Nia couldn't help but question what was really going on. A growing feeling of suspicion began to gnaw at her, leaving her anxious and on edge. She started analyzing every detail, every interaction, trying to piece together some explanation for the drastic change. She noted his constant preoccupation with his phone, which he now kept close, never leaving it unattended. Whenever it rang, he would leave the room to answer, lowering his voice to barely a whisper. She hadn't noticed this secrecy before and wondered what could have triggered it. One evening, she gathered the courage to confront him. She waited until he came home, his face tired, shadows deepening under his eyes. After dinner, she insisted they sit down to talk. She asked him directly, accusing him of hiding something, even going so far as to imply that he might be seeing someone else. Leon reacted defensively, his tone sharp. He assured her that his behavior had nothing to do with infidelity and that he was dealing with serious business issues that she couldn't understand. Frustrated, he dismissed her concerns, attributing her suspicions to her own insecurities. But his response didn't calm her. If anything, it only deepened her doubts. Nia sensed that he was holding something back, something beyond business stress. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a secret he was desperate to keep hidden. Days passed, and she found herself scrutinizing everything about him, unable to ignore the sinking feeling that he was slipping further away from her with each passing day. Nia couldn't shake her suspicions about Leon. Her intuition, along with the coldness growing between them, weighed heavily on her. Desperate to understand what was happening, she confided in her closest friend, Michelle. They met at a small, upscale cafe, where Nia recounted everything in a low, troubled voice. She shared her theories about Leon's detachment and her fears that he might be involved with someone else. Michelle listened patiently, occasionally nodding, but at the end, she laughed softly and suggested a solution she thought harmless. Why don't you go to a fortune teller? Who knows? Maybe she'll give you some peace of mind. Initially, Nia dismissed the idea, but as the hours passed and the nagging unease refused to leave her, she reconsidered. By the next day, curiosity and desperation drove her to a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of Atlanta, where Michelle had once visited a local fortune teller. The house stood between two towering oaks, nearly hidden from the street, with a dimly lit sign reading Madame Esther, Spiritual Guidance. Nia hesitated at the door, her heart pounding, but finally gathered the courage to step inside. Madame Esther was an older woman with piercing dark eyes and a calm, knowing presence. She motioned for Nia to sit and asked her to place her hands on the table. With a brief, intense gaze, Madame Esther seemed to read something in Nia's face. She asked a few pointed questions about Leon, his recent behavior, and Nia's concerns. Nia hesitated but ultimately recounted her story, describing how Leon had become distant, cold, and evasive. Madame Esther listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving Nia. When she finally spoke, her words were unsettling. Your suspicions are not unfounded, but the cause of his behavior is not what you think. Leon is not acting by his own will. He is under a spell, a binding cast by another woman. Nia felt a chill run through her. The idea of a spell was foreign to her, but Madame Esther's calm, matter-of-fact tone made it hard to dismiss. Madame Esther explained that someone had used dark magic to ensnare Leon's heart, causing him to act in ways he couldn't control. She pulled out a small pouch of finely ground herbs, handing it to Nia with explicit instructions. The herbs, she said, would counteract the binding spell if ingested. You must prepare a soup yourself and add this mixture to it. Only then will its power be effective. He must consume it for the spell to be broken. Nia nodded, taking the pouch carefully. Cooking was foreign to her. She had never made anything more complicated than a sandwich. Nevertheless, she accepted the herbs, feeling as though this strange task was her only chance to reclaim Leon's affection. But when she returned home, reality sank in. She had no idea where to start with cooking, and the thought of doing it herself was overwhelming. Ignoring Madame Esther's instructions, Nia decided to enlist their private chef. She handed him the ingredients for the soup, waiting until the end to discreetly sprinkle the herbal mixture into the pot herself. When the soup was ready, she carefully set the table, arranging everything to make the meal look like a small celebration. Nia felt a mix of excitement and fear, wondering if Madame Esther's remedy would work. That evening, Nia meticulously arranged a romantic dinner. She set the table with fine china, lit tall candles that cast a warm glow over the room, and played soft jazz in the background. The centerpiece was the soup, the same one she had added Madame Esther's herbs to, now steaming gently from its place on the table. Nia watched anxiously as Leon entered the dining room, appearing tired but intrigued by the effort she'd put into the setup. She encouraged him to sit down, offering a soft smile to hide her nerves. Leon took the first spoonful, and Nia held her breath, watching for any reaction. He seemed to enjoy it, nodding appreciatively as he continued eating, unaware of the subtle addition. The rest of the evening was uneventful. They exchanged a few polite conversations, and Leon soon retreated to his study, as he often did. Nia watched him go, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. The meal had gone smoothly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling for the night, before finally drifting off. In the early hours of the morning, she was jolted awake by a muffled groan from Leon's side of the bed. She turned to see him curled up, clutching his stomach, his face pale and covered in sweat. He tried to sit up but collapsed back onto the bed, gasping for air. His breathing grew shallow, and his skin, once tan and healthy, had taken on an almost gray hue. Nia panicked, her mind racing as she realized the severity of his condition. She scrambled for her phone and dialed 911, barely able to articulate the problem as she watched him suffer. The paramedics arrived within minutes, lifting Leon onto a stretcher and rushing him to the nearest hospital. Nia followed closely, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. At the hospital, doctors quickly took him into the emergency room, where a team of medical professionals assessed his condition. Hours passed in a blur of anxious waiting and short updates from nurses. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was grave. Leon had been diagnosed with acute poisoning, though they couldn't identify the exact source. Leon's condition continued to deteriorate over the next day. Dark patches began to form across his abdomen, spreading slowly but visibly, resembling intricate webs under his skin. The sight horrified Nia. The patches were unlike anything she had ever seen, almost as if they were something out of a nightmare. She remained at his bedside, holding his hand, but Leon's condition showed no signs of improvement. Each time she looked at him, the patches had darkened and expanded, covering more of his body. His breathing grew weaker, and the doctors were at a loss, unable to explain the unusual symptoms. In desperation, Nia called her grandmother, the only person she trusted enough to share the whole story with. Her grandmother listened intently, her voice calm yet filled with urgency. She advised Nia to take Leon to a church where a pastor she knew could offer spiritual guidance. Nia, with no other options left and a heart full of fear, arranged for Leon to be discharged from the hospital. She clung to the hope that the pastor could provide answers where medicine had failed. As they left for the church, she prayed that whatever was plaguing Leon could be undone before it was too late. Nia arrived at the small church just after dawn, guiding Leon carefully as they stepped inside. The church was modest but warm, its stone walls lined with worn wooden pews and flickering candles. In the stillness, she felt a strange comfort, a sense of hope that had been absent in the sterile halls of the hospital. Leon leaned heavily on her shoulder, his face still ashen, his body weakened from days of pain and uncertainty. They were greeted by Pastor Williams, a tall, gentle man in his 60s with a calm presence and a knowing gaze. He extended his hand to Leon and then looked deeply into Nia's eyes, as if he could sense the weight of her fears. After a moment of silent assessment, he led them into a small side room, explaining that he would begin a process of spiritual cleansing. Nia nodded, clutching Leon's hand as they settled into the room, where the faint scent of incense hung in the air. Pastor Williams began by lighting a circle of candles around Leon, murmuring a prayer under his breath. He asked Nia to step back, assuring her that her love and presence had already been instrumental in bringing Leon to him. As he continued to pray, he held his hands above Leon, moving them slowly as though tracing invisible symbols. His voice grew stronger, reverberating through the room. He spoke of forgiveness, strength, and freedom from dark influences, asking for divine intervention to lift the burden from Leon's spirit. The first session lasted nearly an hour, during which Leon's breathing grew steadier, though he remained too weak to stand on his own. Pastor Williams instructed Nia to return with Leon for the next 3 days, as this ritual required time and patience. Each day, Nia watched as the pastor guided Leon through prayer and cleansing. He would anoint Leon's forehead with holy water, chant protective verses, and occasionally lay his hands on Leon's chest, where the dark patches had formed. By the second session, there was a noticeable change. The blackened marks on Leon's skin had faded slightly, no longer resembling the ominous webs they had been. He began to regain some of his strength, his eyes losing the haunted look that had plagued him in the hospital. Pastor Williams explained to Nia that this was indeed the result of an unnatural force, a binding that had been placed on Leon's soul. Though he didn't specify, she knew he was referring to the charm Madame Esther had spoken of. As Leon grew stronger with each session, Nia's guilt also intensified. She could no longer keep the truth from him. On the morning of the 4th day, she sat beside him on the church steps, her hands trembling as she finally revealed the truth. She told him everything, her suspicions, her visit to Madame Esther, the herbal mixture, and her desperation to free him from whatever had come between them. Tears filled her eyes as she spoke, and her voice broke when she confessed that her only motive had been her love and fear of losing him. Leon listened in silence, his face unreadable as he absorbed her confession. When she finished, he took a deep breath, clearly processing the weight of her words. Though hurt, he looked at her with a new understanding. He knew, on some level, that his behavior hadn't entirely been his own. He took her hands in his, nodding slowly, and for the first time in days, they both felt a tentative sense of peace. The darkness that had surrounded them seemed to lift, replaced by a shared determination to move forward. After weeks of healing both physically and spiritually, Leon finally regained his strength. The dark patches on his skin had faded completely, and the quiet shadow that had clouded his demeanor began to lift. He and Nia spent most days together now, rebuilding their connection slowly, piecing together the trust that had been fractured. But there was one truth Leon knew he had to confront if they were to truly move forward. One evening, as they sat on the back patio of their home, the late summer air warm and heavy, Leon turned to Nia, his face etched with hesitation. He took a deep breath, then began to speak. He confessed that he had indeed been unfaithful, not just once, but repeatedly, with her closest friend, Michelle. Leon's voice was barely a whisper as he admitted it, as if speaking louder would make it more real. He explained how he had felt a strange, almost unnatural pull toward Michelle, one he couldn't explain or rationalize. Despite not truly feeling anything for her, he found himself returning to her, as if under a compulsion. Leon's face was flushed with shame as he recounted the moments he couldn't fully understand, moments that seemed driven by something outside of his control. The attraction to Michelle had always felt wrong, like a weight pulling him in a direction he knew he shouldn't go. He described the guilt he'd felt after each encounter, the confusion, the constant inner battle. As he spoke, his voice broke, and he looked down, visibly disturbed by his own behavior. He confessed that it was one of the reasons he had grown distant from Nia, unable to face her knowing the secret he was keeping. Nia listened in silence, her face a mask of shock and sadness, though she'd braced herself for some sort of revelation. Hearing the details from his own mouth was far more painful than she had imagined. She tried to hold back tears, but felt the weight of betrayal settle heavily in her chest. Still, as she looked at Leon, broken, vulnerable, and genuinely remorseful, she felt a sense of understanding and forgiveness start to well up inside her. She recognized that whatever force had drawn him to Michelle was not entirely his own doing. Leon looked at her, his face full of sorrow and apology, silently pleading for a chance to make things right. His admission was raw, and he didn't try to justify it. He simply took responsibility, expressing deep regret and admitting his weakness. Nia knew that this was a turning point for them. She took a deep breath, feeling her own tears fall, and reached for his hand. She forgave him, not out of naivety or passivity, but from a genuine desire to heal together and rebuild the love that had brought them together. From that night onward, their lives shifted. They made a mutual commitment to attend church together regularly, finding solace in the routine of prayer and community. Every Sunday, they would sit side by side in the pews, each quietly reflecting on the journey they had endured. Leon began joining Nia in the pastor's small group sessions, where he engaged in discussions on humility, repentance, and forgiveness. It became a sanctuary for them both, a place where they could lay down their burdens and focus on what truly mattered. Over time, their relationship deepened, marked by a new honesty and humility. The wounds they had suffered slowly healed as they shared more of themselves, their fears, and their dreams. The memories of betrayal and mistrust softened, replaced by moments of understanding and shared growth. Their home, once a place of tension and secrecy, became a refuge of peace and mutual respect. As they continued their spiritual journey, Nia and Leon found a renewed strength in their love, anchored by faith, forgiveness, and the resilience they had discovered within themselves.